Imagine a teacher appears today, a young man in his early 30s. He speaks without microphones or production, yet his words travel with astonishing speed. He talks about justice, compassion, dignity, a coming transformation. He challenges religious authorities. He unsettles political powers. Some admire him. Some fear him. Some mock him. Some whisper he may be divine. Now imagine this man dies publicly, executed by the state. A moment captured on thousands of phones, a moment the world argues about instantly. Now jump ahead, not 1 year, not 5, but 40 years. 40 years is the distance between 1985 and 2025. 40 years ago, we didn't have smartphones, internet, social media, or digital archives. Memories blur, stories shift, people disagree on what actually happened. Now imagine that in 2025, 4 different authors decide to write the first biographies of that teacher from 1985. Without recordings, without transcripts, without direct notes, and not even speaking the language he spoke. This is the world of the 4 Gospels, 4 narratives written decades after Jesus' death, by people who never met him, in a community far removed from his world. And so we ask the central question, did Jesus think he was God? And if everything we knew about him came from stories written 40 to 60 years after his death, how would we interpret his identity today? This is Beyond Scripture. This is, did Jesus think he was God? A modern-day parallel. Before we begin, if you find value in these historical reflections, consider subscribing and turning on the notifications. It helps this project reach more people, and it lets YouTube know this kind of content matters. And if you feel inclined, a like also supports the channel. Think again about that teacher in 1985, our modern parallel. Imagine crowds gathering around him in small parks, cafes, dusty streets. He heals some, comforts others, challenges many. Rumors spread through word of mouth, not through videos. People debate his meaning immediately. He's a prophet. He's a revolutionary. He's enlightened. He's possessed. He's the Messiah. He's God. But he leaves no writings, no speeches saved, no interviews, only memories, human, imperfect memories. Then he dies, violently, in front of a stunned public. His followers are devastated. Some swear they saw visions of him alive again. Stories circulate, change, grow. Now imagine people in 2025 trying to write the first biographies of that teacher from 1985. They did not witness his life. They rely entirely on decades of oral stories, retold, reshaped, and reinterpreted hundreds of times. This is precisely the situation of Mark, the earliest gospel, written around the year 70 CE, around 40 years after Jesus' death. And then more decades pass before Matthew, Luke, and finally John write their own accounts. 4 accounts written independently, with different goals, for different communities, decades after the events, by authors who almost certainly never saw the man they were writing about. They are not coordinated, they are not harmonized, they are not part of a single storytelling project. Later readers assume they form a unified story, but the original authors never wrote them to fit together. And the fact that they don't always fit together is one of the most important keys to our question. Before we examine the Gospels, we need to step into the ancient world. In the modern mind, divine often means one thing, the one true God, eternal, infinite, all-powerful. But in antiquity, divinity worked very differently. Kings could be called sons of God. Angels could be divine. Miracle workers could be divine. Heroes could be divine. Even wise philosophers could be treated as semi-divine. Divinity was a spectrum, not a category. Humans and divine beings shared a blurred frontier. No ancient Jew believed a human teacher was literally Yahweh, the God of Israel himself. To say Jesus was divine in some sense did not automatically mean he was the same being who created the universe. This distinction is enormous, because centuries later, when Christians say Jesus is God, they mean something drastically different than what ancient Jews meant when they called someone divine. If we forget this distinction, we risk placing modern theology back into ancient texts that never intended it. And this is where the Gospels become fascinating. If the four Gospels had been written together, as a team project, checking each other's drafts, aligning their message, we could treat their differences as small inconsistencies. But that's not what happened. Each Gospel was written in a different decade, in a different region, for a different community, with a different theological goal, without contact with the other authors. In fact, early Christians felt so uncomfortable with the differences that later editors added material to smooth out the rough edges. The clearest example is the long ending of Mark. The earliest manuscripts of Mark end abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8, with the women fleeing the empty tomb in fear and no appearances of the risen Jesus. Later Christians were so troubled by this ending, so different from Matthew, Luke, and John, that someone wrote an additional ending decades later, adding resurrection appearances and instructions, and inserted it into the text. This ending eventually became canonical, but scholars know it was not original. That addition exists because the Gospels were not written to be harmonized. They were not trying to tell one unified story. Only later did the church attempt to gather these four independent portraits into a single collection, which we now call the New Testament. And when we forget that the Gospels were originally independent works, we risk reading them with modern assumptions that their authors never intended. The clearest evidence that the Gospels do not share a single vision of Jesus is the evolution of Christology. That is, how the understanding of Jesus' identity grows over time. Let's examine the most striking examples. 1. Jesus' last words. In Mark, the earliest account, Jesus dies with a cry of abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me?" He sounds human, fragile, anguished, confused, a prophet overwhelmed by suffering. In Luke, the tone softens. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Jesus dies calm, composed, trusting. And then we arrive at John, the latest gospel, written more than 60 years after Jesus' death. Here, Jesus does not cry or falter. He stands in control of his destiny. He declares victory. It is finished. This is not random. This is theological development. From anguished prophet to serene martyr to cosmic redeemer. The more time passes, the more divine Jesus becomes in the narrative. 2. The timing of Jesus' death. In the earliest Gospels, Jesus eats the Passover meal with his disciples before his arrest. He dies the next day. But in John, the timeline changes. Jesus dies at the exact hour that the Passover lambs are being sacrificed in the temple. This is deliberate. John is not reporting history. He is making a theological claim. Jesus is the Passover lamb, the sacrifice that brings liberation, the new meaning of Passover itself. Once again, the later the gospel, the higher the Christology. Most scholars agree that Jesus preached an apocalyptic message. He believed the present world order was ending soon. He expected dramatic divine intervention. He spoke of a kingdom arriving in his generation. But the world did not end. Rome continued. Jerusalem fell. Life moved on. And with the passing of time, Christians were forced to reinterpret Jesus' mission. The failed apocalypse became a spiritual transformation, a cosmic sacrifice, a divine plan fulfilled in his death, a victory over the powers of darkness. By the time John writes his gospel, Jesus' death is no longer a tragedy. It is a cosmic triumph. This reinterpretation is essential in elevating Jesus from prophet to divine figure. If the Gospels show such different portraits of Jesus, why do most Christians today believe he was God himself? The answer comes after the Gospels. Early Christianity was not unified. There were groups who believed Jesus was a prophet, Jesus was adopted by God, Jesus was a divine messenger, Jesus was purely spiritual, Jesus was human and exalted, Jesus was two beings, Jesus was divine but not Yahweh, Jesus was God himself. The diversity was enormous. But over time, the church sought unity. Debates turned into disputes. Disputes turned into councils. Councils turned into creeds. Creeds became dogma. At the Council of Nicaea, 325 CE, the church declared Jesus to be true God from true God. This is centuries after his death, centuries after the Gospels, centuries after the original memories. The identity of Jesus as God himself was not the earliest Christian belief. It was the one that eventually became dominant. Not because it was original, but because it was institutionalized. And so we return to our question. Did Jesus think he was God? If Jesus lived today and his life unfolded before millions of cameras, we could answer with precision. But in the ancient world, we rely on memories written decades later by authors who never met him, in a language he did not speak, in communities far removed from his own. We rely on texts that were later edited, harmonized, and reshaped to fit developing theological visions. We read four independent portraits as if they were one unified story. And when we do, it becomes easy to assume conclusions the texts themselves do not clearly state. The historical Jesus may not have claimed to be Yahweh. He likely saw himself as a prophet, an apocalyptic messenger, perhaps even God's chosen agent. But the Jesus who declares it is finished, who dies as the Passover lamb, who rises in harmonized narratives, that is the Jesus of later Christian memory. The Jesus shaped not only by history, but by centuries of interpretation, devotion, and theological growth. This is not a dismissal of faith. It is an exploration of how stories become scripture and how scripture becomes identity. And somewhere between memory and theology stands a man who changed the world, a man whose story still lives beyond scripture. If this exploration meant something to you, consider subscribing for more historical and textual deep dives. And feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective adds to the conversation.